Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we are looking at the footnotes to Plato's philosophy. In particular, we're using it as a means to study the history of philosophy. Now, I want to make a very bold claim, so stick with me here real quick. I had a professor one time sit down, look us all right in the eye, and say, I want you to realize that Immanuel Kant has probably impacted your life more than Jesus Christ. Now, that's a shocking, bold claim, but what he means by that is that so many of us live in the wake of Kantian agnosticism and the turn towards subjectivity and how it just permeates so much of our thinking, in particular, our thinking about Jesus Christ. Now, obviously, he qualifies this as I'm qualifying this. If somebody's a Christian, clearly Jesus Christ has done more to transform and impact your life, given being born again in the nature of salvation and the act of justification. But we also have to realize that we're called to the renewal of our minds. We're called to think like Christians. And the sad fact of the matter is that a lot of people today have been impacted by the thinking of Immanuel Kant over and above the Christian theological tradition, or specifically put, according to what the Bible teaches about matters. So what I want to do today is I want us to look at Immanuel Kant and many of his successors in order to understand what this might look like in very specific terms, in very specific ways. But I want to do this by illustrating it. There's a hymn that's sometimes sung, and it's something about the resurrection. Now, we understand that historically the resurrection is the idea that the same physical body that went down into the grave of Jesus Christ is the same body that was resurrected, brought out of the grave. And we have historical evidence for it. We have biblical revelation that testifies to it, and those types of matters in a classic apologetic sense. But think about this hymn. Ask me how you know he lives, or how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. And people love that. People sing that in churches, and ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. He lives as an existential experience in my heart. He lives with a subjective feeling within my heart. And so much of modern theology, in particular liberal theology, was built off of this idea that something doesn't necessarily have to be true in the real space-time external world, rather it just has to be a subjective truth. And a lot of this is birthed in Kantian agnosticism. So let's dive into this here, because I think there's many key things for us to understand. And the first one is again, we've said this and we'll say it again, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, Alfred North Whitehead. And we're going to look at things from Kant to Sartre. Now, we've been studying this chart. And in this chart, one of the things that we've seen is that you have rationalism and you have empiricism. And we can understand different propositions according to rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is going to give us typically what's known as an a priori, something coming prior to experience, and an analytic statement. And an analytic statement is something where the predicate is contained in the subject. And in many respects, the subject is contained in the predicate. So an example would be all bachelors are unmarried men. And to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man, and to be an unmarried man is a bachelor. Whereas empiricists would argue that things come after experience, or a posteriori. And they are typically associated with propositions that are known to be synthetic. And a synthetic statement or a synthetic proposition is one where the predicate is not necessarily contained in the subject. So, for example, the analytic is all bachelors are unmarried men. A synthetic is all bachelors are unmarried men who wear red shirts. And we know that there's nothing that's contained in the definition of a bachelor or an unmarried man that requires them to wear a red shirt or a blue shirt or a green shirt or any shirt at all. And that's because from experience, we find that these sort of analytic things have something added unto them. Namely, something from experience is adding knowledge to the situation. And with this, what we see is that Kant is a recipient of this analytic a priori and empirical a posteriori. And what Kant tries to do is he tries to merge these different philosophies into what has become known as the synthetic a priori. And by that, he's trying to give us knowledge about the world that comes prior to experience. Now, what we find is that traditionally, rationalists were analytic a priori and empiricists were synthetic a posteriori. So what he's trying to do is give us the propositional knowledge of the empiricist with the dogmatism or the subjective, the person's a priori categories. And that's why with Kant, he has that not all knowledge comes from the senses. It may begin in the senses, but not all knowledge comes from the senses. So we're going to flesh this out into the fact that we have to look at how the mind forms sense content. So stop right there. Let the fog go away for a minute. And I want us to use this kind of an illustration. And it's an illustration. So I grew up in Iowa, God's great, glorious land of Iowa. And I love Iowa. I truly do. I would move back there in a heartbeat. But in Iowa, we get a lot of snow. And at night, you would have to drive, and sometimes it would be snowing, and you would have your lights on. And we know that snow is uncategorized in one sense. You know, we haven't put it into a snowman or whatever somebody wants to make. It's just sort of this, you know, unfiltered, just comes out at you. But when you're driving and you have the lights on, when the light is on the snow, you can sort of see little patterns, and it sort of gives categories to the snow itself. So bear with me here. What Kant is trying to argue is that we have these categories and these forms of intuition in the mind, space and time, but these categories like causality and different things like that. And they're like the lights that a person has on their car. But you have the world in and of itself that's uncategorized, the sense content. And as the categories and the sense content come together, that creates and forms knowledge, just much like the light and the snow may create something in that regard when you're driving down the road. But the point of it is that you don't know the object in and of itself, but only as it appears unto you, only as your mind structures reality. And the reason that's so important is because this is what's become known as the subjective turn. You don't know objects, hence objectivity. You only know subjects, hence a turn towards subjectivity. And what this does, as we look at the chart here, specifically as you get into what is known as idealism, the harder forms of idealism, when we looked at that briefly with Hegel and with other figures and different people like Berkeley, but it really brings us into existentialism and phenomenology and deconstructionism. And we're going to discuss all of those, but it also gets us into postmodernism, or just this radical subjectivity, this radical idealistic subjectivity. So with no further ado, let's continue on here. So epistemological idealism, agnosticism, the synthetic a priori, transcendental reasoning with Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is an 18th century German philosopher. And one thing that I want you to see here is that many of the key figures are German philosophers. In many respects, German philosophy bought into this almost lock, stock, and barrel. And much of German philosophy and the philosophy in the country surrounding it were very idealistic. And in this, Kant is considered the father or even the founder of agnosticism or transcendental idealism. Now, transcendental reasoning is not just some guy sitting out in the middle of Fairfield, Iowa, which has the Maharishi School of Transcendental Meditation. Go check it out. It'll freak you out. But not somebody that's just transcending and doing these sort of transcendental yoga, blah, blah, blahs. Transcendental reasoning is synthetic a priori reasoning. It's the lights in the snow type of reasoning. That's transcendental reasoning. Now, it can come in a variety of ways, but at its core, at its crux, that's what transcendental reasoning is. It's this notion of synthetic a priori reasoning. Now, Kant worked to mediate the debate between dogmatism and skepticism, or between rationalism and empiricism, or as it was here, between Cartesian rationalists' innate ideas, and skeptical empiricism, which was Hume's empiricism, by teaching that reason and the senses work together. He's trying to have something come together with them. Now, he's not the first philosopher to say that reason and the senses work can come together, but the way he does it is what is that's unique. You know, Aristotle would have said reason and the senses work together, but believe me, he's rejecting the Aristotelian tradition in that regard. As we said, Aristotle claimed the senses and reason work together through abstraction of universal and necessary forms from particular and contingent things. Kant taught that they work together because reason informs categories on the uninformed and unknowable world of our sense experiences, namely things such as time and space and physics, categories like causality and possibly in logic, and the idea like God and the soul in metaphysics. So what we have to see is that, think of this, Kant said they work together by saying these categories inform or impress things upon the unknowable, unimpressed sense experience. So we could think of it in one sense like a cookie cutter, people have said. You've got cookie dough that's out there that's shapeless and formless, and then what does the cookie cutter that has the shape do to it? It presses on there and it gives you the shape. And in that, causality isn't something in and of the object, rather it's something we impose upon the object. Or things like space and time aren't necessarily in the objects. They're things that we impose upon them. Now, one thing that's different about Kant versus other figures is that for Kant, he argued that everybody has the same category. So in that sense, it gave a sense of universality. Whereas as you look at later figures and you get into postmodernism or critical theory, they're going to give us this idea of something imposing upon the world, but we all have different categories. And we'll look at this. Our historical categories are categories of being or linguistic makeup or racial, gender, all these different makeups that can give different categories put on there. So in one sense, the way that you move forward with all the later philosophies is you just deny where Kant started in the first place. You deny transcendental reasoning and synthetic a priori reasoning. You do away with it and you come back to the ideas that are before him. In other words, in order to move forward, you have to move back. You have to reject this Kantian tradition in order to reject the conclusions that are derived from the Kantian sort of advent into philosophy. In short, in this sense, with Kant, science is no longer discovery of what is in the world, but it becomes a form of art or the construction or creation of what is. Reality is never known in and of itself, but only as it appears unto the individual. And science, following Hume, was coming under great peril. And the reason for it is that if we can't really know these causalities and we're left with skepticism, science is toast, because then we can't actually understand repeated processes and we can't use induction and the scientific method. But Kant thought that he was able to save the scientific method in that he could give an account for consistent causality and consistent time and space and all of his other categories that he gives us, or forms and intuition. But in doing so, he radically redefined what science is. It's not a discovery of what's in the world. You're not actually going to the things and the objects in and of themselves. Rather, you're constructing them. The mind is a creative force in that sense, not a discovering force. That's because you don't know reality in and of itself, but only as it appears unto the individual. So let's keep looking at this. It has been said Kant created what is known as the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Now, for Copernicus, he argued that the earth revolved around the sun, not that the sun revolved around the earth. And we know the great debates that came about it. Is the earth the center of the entire universe? And he would say, no. He would say, it's not that everything revolves around us or the sun in this regard. Rather, we go around the sun. And the point is that the objects change. The center focus of things change. And what this means is that figures prior to Kant claimed that the mind conformed unto the world. Kant claims that the world conforms unto the mind. That's the Copernican revolution. That's the great change. What is the object of knowledge? For his predecessors, you have objects in the world and the mind conforms unto those objects. You know those things. Kant claims that the world conforms unto the mind. There's not an object in the world. You have uncategorized sense data that takes on an object form, that takes on the confirmation into the mind. It's not discovery of what's out there. It's an internal, external coming together whereby we almost artistically create, impose, form the lights with the snow, the cookie cutter on the dough, all the rest. The point is this is a total redefinition of truth, to claim that truth is a confirmation object to the mind instead of the mind to the object. Truth as correspondence in the classic sense has been denied, has been destroyed, because truth for Kant is no longer that which corresponds to reality, because that presupposes you actually know reality and that your propositions conform unto that reality and that there's a similarity between them. Kant, notice this, still affirms a world of ideas, but they are no longer ideas, capital I, but ideas in the lowercase. Our minds do not discover them, rather they create them. See the key difference here? Kant literally changed the face of Western philosophy in this regard. And that's why when we look at our chart, he is the center point of modern philosophy. He's the most influential figure of modern philosophy because of his Copernican revolution. And everything that follows him lives in the wake of Kant's philosophy. Because what he's giving us is this idea of a non-cognitive, non-propositional view of the world in one sense, but also specifically God and divine revelation. So historically, we've argued that in the traditional idea, God is known cognitively. There's real truth value in what we're saying about God. There's content there, and that content can be put in propositional form. Kant would argue with his idea of religion within the realms of reason and a total redefinition of what religion looks like is that you can't actually know God, because in one sense, going back to our illustration, you've got the snow that the light can grasp. But the problem with divine snow or metaphysics or the soul is that there's no snow to grasp. It's beyond. We're left with these radical antinomies. So it's a non-cognitive form. And if there's no cognitive form, it can't be in propositional form. Whereas you see later thinkers try to modify that in some regard. But the point that we have to see is this, is that theological liberalism is birthed off of this. And figures such as Schleiermacher and the advent of higher criticism and theological liberalism are based in Kant's view. So it's a subjective religion. Ask me how I know he lives within my heart. Jesus rose in the hearts of the disciples, not in the space-time real world in that regard. And that's why within figures like Schleiermacher and what has become really just the dominant view of religion within our universities today, it is this non-cognitive, this non-propositional, this idea that revelation is dead, and even if we did have something from God, it doesn't actually tell us anything about God. The real consequences, we could go on and on and on, but we just have to see that Kant was the Copernican revolution in modern philosophy because he completely changed the object of knowledge and the way that humans supposedly structure knowledge. Now, moving on to another figure, this notion of historical relativism with Hegel. Now, Hegel was a 19th century German philosopher. No, two German philosophers in a row. Hegel believes in the notion of Platonic ideas. They exist objectively and they can be known. So notice, this is a difference here. However, the ideas are not eternal and can change. For him, all is change and truth itself changes throughout history. History is considered the outgrowth of God or the absolute. For Hegel, everything is in a stage of evolution, and in a sense, everything is divine. He's a pantheist in that regard. So Hegel and Spinoza were both pantheists, but Hegel was a historical relativist. So again, what we have to see here is that he has this notion that there are ideas, but these ideas are not necessarily eternal in the Platonic sense. The ideas are evolving. Notice for Plato, they were static. Justice was always justice, and it's never going to change to justice 2.0. It's always going to be justice. Whereas for Hegel, due to this outgrowth, and what we're going to look at is the dialectic, and some debate whether or not it's in his writings. I tend to think that they are, but the point is that all change and truth itself changes throughout history. It's in process. It's this historical relativism that literally changes the stability of the ideas in the capital sense. But this is what's known as his evolutionary stage or stages of reality. And for him, even God is in constant flux. So if the very foundation of all of reality, God in and of himself, can change, then why can't lower things like us change? Now notice, he is a pantheist. So there may be gradations, but in the end, they're all God. And if the highest form of the gradation can change, and the ideas associated with the highest form of that can change, then all the lower forms can change too. But for him, it was done through historical relativism. Now notice this, Plato was neither a pantheist nor a historical relativist. So these are some of the key changes that we see, the key footnotes within Hegel. Now, like I said, there's a lot of people that debate whether or not Hegel actually affirmed the dialectic. We'll just say that he did, or if you deny it, we'll just say that he didn't. But the point that you need to see is that for Hegel, you have a thesis and an antithesis, and everything is in constant synthesis, coming together. So you have the two different poles, and the historical evolutionary feature going forward is to do away with those two poles into a new synthesis, which becomes a new thesis. And then a new antithesis will come, and they come together, which forms a new thesis, then a new antithesis. And this keeps going and going and going and going. So we can give an example of this from what has become known as dialectical theology, really neo-orthodox theology. And we could say something like this: Jesus Christ, some people say that he's sinless, and other people say that he is a sinner. So theological liberalism would say that he was a sinner, because to be a human is to errare humanum est, and to err, whereas the classic idea of the sinlessness of Christ would say, no, to err is not necessarily human. You can be human and not err. But dialectical theology would say, well, they must synthesize together. So Jesus was both a sinner and sinless, maybe sinless according to his divine nature, sinner according to his human nature. We see how these things can come together, but we live with this all the time. In fact, this is what people view as this whole dialectical approach, this Hegelian third way approach, is viewed as knowledge today. You know, you can't be at the two extremes. You got to meet in the middle. And that's why I call it the Mr. Middleman approach, which dominates the academic world today. In order to be seen as academic and somebody who's dealing with the data, you can't be on either extreme. You got to somewhere be in the middle. You have to form synthesis to the different views that are out there. And that's so much of what permeates our world today. You know, we don't need to be Catholic nor Protestant. We got to find some middle in between. We don't need to be a liberal or conservative. We got to be a moderate. The moderates are where the real thinkers are at. Well, I hate to say it, you're a footnote on Plato, and your footnote should be spelled Hegel. Hegel, third way, dialectical, synthetic approach to reality. Sometimes truth exists in and of itself, and the contrary of it is exclusive. And anything in the middle, anything that's a gradation of it, can still be exclusive, because truth by its very definition is exclusive. 1 + 1 is 2. And if you say it's 2.1 or 2.3 or 2.5, you're still wrong, because truth by definition corresponds to reality. And by the rational laws of logic, it excludes all things that are contrary to reality. This is why we can't be idealists. We got to have reality to push back against our ideas and to push back against our theses. But if everything's in flux and everything's based off of uncategorized notions of transcendental reasoning or something along those lines, there is no reality to push back against our claims. We're left in pure relativism. Now, we move on to another one with communism and Marx. Marx was a 19th century, German philosopher. You can't tell, I'm not a big fan of German philosophy. I think there's a lot of pitfalls in it, and we can see it just in the first three figures here. Now, Marxism or communism is considered dialectical materialism. Now, your mind should just immediately go off. What is the dialectic? Well, for him, what he's granting us is the concept of the dialectic. You have different poles, thesis and antithesis, and we got to have syntheses to go forward. Now, notice he's a dialectical materialist because he accepts Hegel's claim that everything evolves through history, historical relativism, via a dialectical process. The content for Marx, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is material, not spiritual. Hegel would have said it was spiritual. For Marx, it was a material aspect. And in particular, it's a class struggle where we see these thesis, antithesis, and the revolution is the synthesis coming forward. It's not an evolution of God for Marx. Remember, Marx was an atheist, but of matter. He was a materialist. Politically, Marx affirmed the collective ownership of all wealth for everyone, so there would be no private property or private families. Marx abolishes different classes and strives for a classless society. Plato also tried to have a communal aspect, but he restricted it to a small class of philosopher kings in this regard. So, for Marx, the way that the dialectical materialism must move forward is by getting rid of classes, to have a classless society. And this is really what is done through collective ownership of all wealth for everyone. So, no private property, no private families. We got to abolish the different classes. Marx taught a utopian or classless society will come through a violent revolution, not through Plato's rational persuasion. So what we have to see here is that what is the dialectical materialism? What is the synthesis? It's the revolution for Marx. It's this doing away of the classless society, this whole idea of communism, and even forms of socialism, the idea where we just got to do away with the classes and come to this utopian class, is fundamentally the utopian class is the synthesis. But again, if that approach to knowledge is incorrect, notice this: the synthesis is always, the whole idea of the dialectic is always something that never changes. You ever notice that? Everything is in constant flux except the dialectic. So the view in and of itself is self-referentially incoherent. But when they apply it to things, they think that it's coherent. But if the method in and of itself is incoherent, then all the things derived from the method would be incoherent too. Now, figures will say, well, sometimes we see that we find things and we meet in the middle. Okay, but is that done via the dialectic, or is that sometimes used by rational evaluation of the ideas according to traditional definitions of knowledge? Now, notice this. Plato did have some communist aspects to him, but it wasn't of every class in society when it came to wealth. It was for the philosopher kings. Marx says, nope, get rid of it all. And for him, he doesn't want to do it through Plato's rational persuasion where we convince people of it. You bring it by war and revolution. And what's interesting is that we live in a communist era today. You know, we thought that communism was regulated to countries far away, and, you know, Rocky beat the communist Russian, and, you know, we've done away with that. But the reality is that we're living in a communist era once again. You know, all the things coming about with sort of this race Marxism within critical race theory and all the forms of it, whether it be medical forms of it, where we have coming about with who's the oppressed? Well, it's those of the minority races. Who's the oppressor? White people. Well, how do we do it? We got to get rid of all the classes or the different race statuses. Really, they mean whiteness. And the revolution that we bring it about is coming into an awareness of the new synthesis of the utopian society, of which we do away with these oppressive notions. We could give example after example after example. In fact, I would tell you to go read the book Race Marxism on that by James Lindsay. Very, very good book. Moving forward, Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill was a 19th century English philosopher, so he's not a German philosopher. And utilitarianism is considered an ethical philosophy that affirms we should be happy, and that happiness is pleasure, and that pleasure is subjective. Hence, unlike Plato, there is no idea of the good or objective universal moral norms or truth norms in this sense. He's not saying that to be happy is to fulfill this particular end goal norm objective of human nature. Now, he does have one norm, and that's the idea of happiness for the greatest number of people. But it's not like it's an idea of the good that all people should fulfill. It's a subjective ethical philosophy that says, yes, we should all be happy, and happiness is found in pleasure. You know, nobody's happy when they're out there doing something they don't like. But the problem is that different people like different things. You know, for one individual, running a marathon is hell. And for a different individual, running a marathon is like the triumph of what they can do. They find no greater enjoyment than running a marathon. But that's what he's going to use as this sort of material data to say, see, pleasure is subjective. Now, people can have personal preferences, but those personal preferences don't deny the notion of objective truths or the idea that there's an objective happiness. It's an ethical philosophy rooted in subjectivity. Now, utilitarianism is skeptical of all metaphysics, of natural teleological design for human beings, final causes, natural ends, true purposes for all things, and of any concept of a universal moral law. Why? Because if metaphysics is true and essences are real, which means that there would be an identity that's fixed and final and stable for all people in all places and all times, and the notion of teleological design, we're fit for a purpose. We have an end. There's something that we're striving to fulfill. And if there's a universal moral law, which means all people have the same ethic that we're called to live unto, then the whole notion of subjective ethical philosophy falls apart. You have to do away with those things in order to have a subjective philosophy. You have to do away with standards in order to give a subjective, quote, almost standardless philosophy. And that's true not only for Mill, but for any philosophy that people are going to advocate today. No, there's only one rule or maxim, namely, do only that which will produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, namely, maximize pleasure to the most people in the greatest amount. The end of fulfilling this maxim is justified by any means. One must do whatever it takes to make the most people happy. Nothing judges this end goal. In this sense, this is an anti-Plato, because in the Republic, justice is to judge action. Mill would deny all of that aspect of Plato. Why? Because our actions necessarily are determined by subjective ends. We fulfill it, not by fulfilling the concept of justice, but we have one rule, one maxim that is applied to the greatest number of people and to creating the greatest happiness. The ends justify the means. Whereas for this, within traditional Platonic philosophy, the ends determine the means. It's not only the right thing, but the right way. But within utilitarianism, the end, whatever greatest happiness might mean, justifies any way that you get to it. And utilitarianism, unfortunately, performs a lot of unjust acts in its goal of seeking justice, or it makes a lot of people very unhappy in its desire to make a greater number of people happy. And in that regard, it totally disregards the human element of particular individuals. And in that regard, one of the reasons that historic philosophy and Christian philosophy in particular talks about the inherent value of all people is that it is never right at any time, in any place, to trump those made in the image of God for your personal happiness, even if you got 100 people standing behind you. Because happiness is something that should be applied to all people according to an objective, universal, moral norm or a moral, natural law in that regard. Now, as we continue here, we're going to jump into some of the existentialists. And the issue with existentialism is that it takes a variety of forms, and not forms in the sense of Platonic forms, but it's expressed in a variety of ways. And historic realism would argue that to be is to do. Your nature determines your actions. And existentialism tries to flip that on its head and say, no, to do determines what you're going to be. So to do is to be. Your actions, the sum culmination of your actions determine your essence or your nature. So to be is to do is realism. To do is to be is existentialism. And do is Sinatra. Laugh on three. 1, 2, 3. But the point is that our actions determine our nature. So notice this. Kierkegaard was a 19th century Danish philosopher, and he's considered the figurehead of what could be considered Christian existentialism. Now, I think existentialism is, in many respects, antithetical to the Christian faith. And that's because of what it does to the nature of creation and reality and epistemology and metaphysics that are related to it. But you have existentialism, and you have people that thought that they could merge Christianity with existentialism. And the key figure for that was Soren Kierkegaard. Now, existentialism, whenever people ask me what it is, I say, well, it's a philosophy of being. And they look at you and they go, what is a philosophy of being? Well, a philosophy of being is understanding the way things exist or how things exist. And that's why we looked at this whole idea. Realism taught that our natures determine our actions, whereas existentialism teaches that our actions determine our nature. Natures are never fixed, but constantly fluid. Now, there's debate about when it becomes fixed or if it becomes fixed. And in many regards, some kind of existential crisis might bring a fixture to it, or death might bring the ultimate fixture to it, or something might define you more than others. So you need to have your Abraham-like faith crises within Kierkegaard's literature, and that's a defining moment, but it's not final and fixed. There could be something else that could bring it about. Or with later philosophers, they would talk about how death is the final action of our fluid transitions in this regard. But the point is that actions are determining the being of an individual. We're in constant flux in that regard. So, like Pascal, and unlike Plato, Kierkegaard emphasized faith over reason, the subjective over the objective, the individual over the universal, the personal over the impersonal, the supernatural over the natural. And when it comes to understanding Kierkegaard, he's really the father of what became known as Christian fideism. And fideism is this notion that we don't come to know God by reason. Reason doesn't really touch the things of God. Rather, it's by a blind leap of faith. Now, Pascal, in one regard, was close to that, but it comes to its fullest form in a figure like Kierkegaard. And traditionally, let's just say we have an elevator, the classic example. The elevator opens, the lights are on, you see the weight limit, somebody bigger than you steps off of it. So by a rational investigation of the situation, you're going to step onto the elevator. Whereas fideism says, well, we don't have that kind of rational investigation. We don't have these objective, reason-based approaches specifically to things of religion. So the elevator opens, no lights on. There's no sign giving a weight limit. You don't know if somebody's coming off of there. So you don't even know if there's a floor that's in there because the light's not on. So you have to go through an existential crisis, take a blind leap of faith into the dark. And that's somehow considered to be the greater moment, the greater expression of faith over reason. Now, Kierkegaard taught that there are different stages of life, like the ethical, religious, aesthetic, and one of the goals is to transcend whatever previous stage you're on. But they are not, and this is not found in objective reason, but power, but in a personal nor power, not objective reason or power, but in a personal faith. This is an anti-Plato approach because natures are in flux and there are no objective, final, fixed, objective moral goals for all of society. And it's also an anti-Plato approach because reason doesn't determine that which is the good. Rather, reason somehow can't know the good and you hope that you find reason. It's sort of like the guy fell out of the cave, or he's called to just jump out of the cave and hope that the dark abyss that he's falling into gets him where he's wanting to go. Whereas for Plato, it's a rational approach. It's one that can be climbed up out of, and your natures aren't in constant flux. You know, the same man that left the cave is the same man that saw the outside world, and he's the same man that came into the cave and tried to free the other slaves. Whereas with these sort of existential approaches, your nature's not final and it's in fluid change. So you have caveman who has an existential crisis outside and he's different. And then he comes back in and he has another experience with the slaves and he's different. He gets killed and it's different. There's a radical understanding of metaphysics that's completely different than existentialism and classic realist philosophy. You have atheistic existentialism with Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a 19th century German atheistic philosopher. Nietzsche is probably the most anti-Platonic thinker in the history of Western philosophy. For not only all the things that we just said about Kierkegaard, but he goes much further than that. For example, Nietzsche taught that God is dead, and by that he means not only the God of Christianity, but also any notion of Platonism, namely the notion of transcendental ideas, transcendental not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense that they transcend the material world, objective transcendentals, good, true, beautiful, philosophy, morality, and religion. So all of these things are dead. Now, it's interesting that there are sort of three definitions of transcendental that are used here. And I want to clarify that because I think it's a key point to understanding the history of philosophy. You have that which transcends the material world. So that could be like the ideas. You have transcendentals, which are the way that the ideas that say good, true, and beautiful are found in different kinds of beings. So God is good and human beings are good and the art painting is good. They're all different kinds of beings, one being divine being, another being sentient, rational, a rational being with the human being. And then you have the painting, which is a material thing that's not rational in and of itself. And in that sense, it transcends all the different kinds of beings. So we have that which transcends just the physical world, that which transcends or can be found in all kinds of beings, and then the transcendental method, which is Kant's synthetic a priori. So he's trying to do away with all of these types of notions. Nietzsche's philosophy is literally that of the cave and the cave alone. There's nothing outside of the cave. You are stuck in the cave. There are no transcendentals in that regard. He considered himself religiously as the Antichrist and philosophically as the anti-Socrates and anti-Plato, because God is dead, the Christian moral norms are dead, and we have killed him. But all transcendental reasoning in the Platonic sense of the term of transcendental ideas or Socrates or the forms or the ideas are dead too. We got to do away with them and find a consistent philosophy with this. Now, Nietzsche was a philosopher who used a hammer of suspicion and cynicism to destroy not only God, but the will to truth, the desire to even pursue truth, free will, dignity, the soul, immortality, the inherent value of man, objective morals, etc., etc. He was, in this sense, a belligerent skeptic who cynically tried to get you to no longer even desire to find answers to these questions. You are literally left with this epitome of nihilistic despair. There are no answers. We cannot find the answers. Give up on the pursuit. God is dead and we have killed him. And the reality is that when man kills God, man then goes and kills other human beings. And so much of this nihilistic philosophy has given rise to an ethic of, well, if there are no objective universal moral norms and there's no objective inherent value for human beings, why not do away with them? And that's why many of the tyrant leaders of modern philosophy were based upon two key ideas: evolutionary Darwinianism, which is the idea that, well, there is no final fixed human nature, it's an evolutionary process. We don't need God to grant and ground things. And atheistic existentialism with Nietzsche and nihilism. This idea of, well, what difference does it really make? There are no objective, universal, moral, objective norms. Nietzsche's Superman, which is his term, is the one who kills both God and anything objective that might image God. We must transcend this aspect of humanity and become the new man. So notice, in this sense, it's like the dialectic in that regard. We must do away. And the right way moving forward is to become the Superman, the new man, the enlightened man who's done away with this idea of God and Christianity and Platonic philosophy and the forms and all of this. Now, what's interesting is that Dostoevsky explored the real entailments of Nietzsche's philosophy in his book Crime and Punishment, where he lays out what this looks like. What is a consistent nihilistic philosophy? And the reality is that it's a world of suspicion, cynicism, despair, murder, and killing of one another. And that has been a hallmark of 20th century societies, because ideas have consequences. And the consequences of those ideas sometimes are the death of people around you. Now you have ontological existentialism with Heidegger. And Heidegger's notion is that our beings are necessarily being changed, and that fundamental being aspect affects the way that we read texts or the way that we interpret things, that we all have different being structures. Actions have given us different being fissures in this regard. And because we all have different beings, different natures in that sense, because we all are the culmination of our different actions, and people don't have the same actions in their lives, we necessarily don't read texts the same way or experience things the same way. So Heidegger was a 20th century German existential philosopher. Again, another German. Heidegger was a strong critic of Plato, whose philosophy he considered as rather vague, but Heidegger's philosophy is incredibly vague. However, it is clear that he does not mean by being exactly what Plato meant by being, objective reason and essences and of ideas. He is strongly opposed to the notion of truth as a capital T, as that which corresponds to reality, or a correspondence between reason and its object. So there is no notion of truth in and of itself. And propositionally, when we're trying to say truth is that which corresponds to reality, so there really is a chair that exists in the reality that's out there, he doesn't want a correspondence between reason and its object. Heidegger claims that the best approach to studying being, and the way he's defining it, is to understand human existence, or being there, or Dasein, or being in the world. And if you're confused now, well, that's kind of part of his project here. So Dasein is a construction of two different German words, sein being the to be verb, and da being a demonstrative pronoun in that regard, and thrown together, it's, you don't understand just being, but being that's thrown out there, being as it exists in human experience, or the understanding of human existence, this idea of being in the world. Dasein is fundamentally not about substances, though, or objects of reason, but subjective elements and the subjectivity in being. In short, being is not like anything you've classically understood as being. It's not an object, essence, subject, object, or anything common amongst things themselves. That's kind of where you need to leave it, because we need many, many more lectures to even get close to understanding Heidegger. So his big thing is he's a departure from Plato because he doesn't define being the same way as Plato. And it's a human consciousness understanding of being, according to Dasein, as we're thrown into the world of consciousness in the world itself. If you're confused, good. Heidegger's confusing. Nihilistic existentialism, another form of nihilism with Sartre, or Sartre, some people would say. Sartre, or Sartre, was a 20th century French philosopher. So notice this, these ideas are crossing borders. Ideas transcend different places. Sartre can recognize the distinction between being of objects and being of subjects, but he denies being itself. There's absolutely no being, or a nihilist, which means no being. So nihilism is fundamentally a philosophy of no being, being in the capital B of the sense. You have lowercase beings of objects and beings of subjects, but there's no overarching being or the forms like Plato would have given us. There are only objects being in itself and human subjects being for itself, but no being per se. Sartre denies being because it functions as an absolute, possibly even a god. He views his approach as the true consequences of actual atheism. Each subject seeks to reduce each other to an object, namely being for itself reduces being in itself. This is the true application of Nietzsche's will to power over other individuals. So, justice is impossible. In fact, all of the Platonic ideals are impossible. Love, goodness, beauty, truth, all these different things. They do not exist at all. That exists is vanity and power struggles between different human beings. So they don't exist. So all you have is power struggles between individuals. And what this is where you start to see the nihilistic, what difference does it make? We just have to will to power over other people, sort of fight or be destroyed mentality. So in short, we spent most of our time looking at the effects of idealism and the turn towards radical subjectivity. You get away from a world of objective norms, and doing away with objective true moral norms does away with true objective moral norms and epistemological norms and metaphysical norms. And in many respects, that's the idealistic tradition. That's existentialism and phenomenology. And ultimately, we'll see that into deconstructionism. Now, it's interesting because people didn't necessarily always agree with Kant and his categories. Some people actually saw them as too dogmatic and too rational, and they tried to find other ways to transcend reason in and of itself. So some people would say, well, the way that we understand reality is not through Kant's categories, but through feeling and emotions. And that's, in many respects, the German idealists coming after him, the Romantic movement. Or you have other figures that say it's not us going to the world, rather it's the divine coming to us. And that would sort of be Hegel's wall that he's transcending in that regard. But the point that you need to see here is that the Copernican revolution found in Kant's transition of where the object of knowledge is formed. And we don't discover knowledge, rather we create knowledge. And that turn towards subjectivity gave us an avenue or a philosophy by which we did away with reason as a validating norm for understanding the world in which we live. And in that regard, it's one of the most anti-Platonic approaches. That footnote in and of itself is probably one of the biggest footnotes in the history of philosophy. So with no further ado, we are going to transition to our final lecture next time, and we're going to bring us up to the contemporary scene. And I hope you found that this footnotes approach is truly a footnotes approach. So all of you academic philosophers out there who are furious that I didn't cover every specific detail about these figures, well, that's the point. Get over it. If you want to do that, you can get your own recording studio going and do it yourself. But with this, it's a footnotes approach. It's a basic approach to understanding the history of ideas so that people can understand the conversations that are taking place around them.